The top business stories, live from the Sky Newsroom. America first, but what about everybody else? We'll explore the worldwide impact of Trump's 25% tariff on US car imports. The Prime Minister says that no one wants a trade war, but that all options are on the table. Also ahead, group chat nightmare. We'll delve into the high-level security breach, which has brought into question how we use messaging apps. And we'll dissect the Chancellor's spring statements and ask whether businesses can cope with higher wages and higher taxes from next week. Yeah, very good afternoon on this Thursday, Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey. The Prime Minister says that he is engaged in intense discussions with Donald Trump over the US President's decision to introduce new tariffs. American car importers will face a 25% levy from the 2nd of April. So Keir Starmer has insisted that all options are on the table.
I think that rather than jumping into a trade war, it is better pragmatically to come to an agreed way forward on this if we can, and that's why we're intentionally engaging in the way that we are. But look, we always have to put the national interest first, and that's why I've also been clear that as we engage in those negotiations, those discussions, we will keep all options on the table.
Well, let's take a closer look at what President Trump has announced. He signed an executive order introducing a 25% tariff on all cars imported into the United States. Data shows that the UK exported £6.4 billion worth of cars to the US in 2023. UK car exports to the US account for just over 18% of all car exports. That's more than car exports to the US from Germany and the Netherlands. The US was the top sales market for Jaguar Land Rover last year. It's a key market also for Aston Martin and Rolls-Royce too. Well, our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, has been looking at the numbers.
Cars, as a component, as a product, are about, the most important, the most iconic manufactured thing that both we make and that is made around the world. So it's no surprise that Donald Trump has started to focus on this. It's worth just kind of relating what we've just heard about from the US president to what we've just heard about from the Chancellor in the spring statement, because obviously we had a lot of detail on the state of the UK economy, and it raises the question, how much could all of that be changed in the event of these tariffs, but also a potential wider trade war? So just quick bit of revision here. This is what the growth forecast said last time around. We got the update in the spring statement, a bit of a cut for this year, quite a big cut for this year, but upgrades in the future years. So remember that. The economy was looking like it was going to be growing quite fast if you're not assuming there's going to be a trade war. And then, of course, the focus wasn't just on economic growth. The focus as well was on the state of the public finances, and a lot of focus on this, headroom, the amount of headroom the Chancellor had against her fiscal targets. So much emphasis on trying to keep that headroom at £9.9 billion, because, of course, it went down as a result of the economy being weaker, as a result of higher debt interest costs. All of that headroom got wiped out. And why does all of this matter? Why are we fixating on this notion of headroom and fiscal rules? It's because the Chancellor did all of those cuts, whether it was welfare cuts, spending cuts, all of the rest of it, a lot of them with lots of impacts on many people, just to try to get this back to £9.9 billion. So it's incredibly consequential, at least as far as she's concerned. Raising the question, what happens to that in the event of a trade war? Well, the Office of Budget Responsibility actually did an exercise on this, and look at this. So if tariffs are imposed on China, on Canada, on Mexico. So China's already facing the tariffs, but what about Canada? What about Mexico? Here's what would happen to that headroom. So the UK economy would be impacted and the headroom would go down. If you have a wider trade war, look at what it does to this again. That goes down basically to zero. It gets wiped out. So regardless of what Rachel Reeves does, the impact of what's happening right now in the White House, elsewhere in the US, could have an enormous impact, far bigger than any of the impacts that she's taken so far in the UK. And it's not just on the fiscal situation, it's also growth. So you saw the growth numbers before. This is just reiterating what the growth forecasts from the Office of Budget Responsibility were yesterday. How do they get impacted if you do have a trade war? Well, if you have an all-out trade war, look at these bars, OK? They get cut by a lot, basically more than halved in most of these years going out into the future. So what looked like strong growth basically suddenly disappears, and you're left with maybe not quite a recession, but quite close to it. Certainly very weak growth off into the future. Again, that's as a result of global factors. Final thing to say, how much could the UK be impacted by this? And when you look at the different exports from Britain to the US, the different categories, well, we send a lot of machinery to the US, also lots of pharmaceuticals, precious metals, that's mostly gold just kind of floating around part of the financial system, optical equipment. But the second biggest of all the categories of things that the UK sends to America, it's vehicles. This is looking back over the last few years, so it's £35 billion over the last 5 years. That is a lot of money. It's a big part of the economy. And if that does get affected, that's going to have big consequences, all of which is why this stuff, it's not theoretical anymore. It's becoming quite real. And, you know, we've spoken to producers of steel who are now already having to pay those tariffs. The longer this stays in place, the more the damage on the UK economy could be.
That was Ed Conway with the latest figures around those tariffs that Donald Trump say will be introduced from next week. Let's move on to the spring statement, though, because the world has changed. Those were the words of Rachel Reeves. That's following on from, of course, the October budget. That was the message she really wanted to deliver at that spring statement in the Commons yesterday. Rachel Reeves said she was on track, though, to meet her target to get public spending under control and to reduce debt 2 years ahead of schedule. Let's speak to a former Labour advisor, Tom Watson, and co-founder of Woburn Partners. That is Heather Verthen. Heather, very good afternoon to you. I think the first question, I suppose, is that it was going to be a difficult day, always going to be a difficult day for Rachel Reeves. And today, you know, the papers were a sign of that, getting kind of attacked by the left for making these spending cuts, particularly in welfare. And then from the right, essentially saying there's just not a plan for immediate growth.
Yeah, it was always going to be a really tough day for Rachel and the broader government. These fiscal events have not been very pretty in recent years for any government. Labour Party in a particularly difficult position because they've got to balance the books and make sure that the markets have confidence in this government. Do not want another repeat of the bond markets and gilt markets as they have been before. So have to make some difficult decisions on things like welfare reform. But yeah, it's a really, really hard moment for Labour. However, I do think that they feel positive about some of the data that's come out, close to 2% growth in the coming years being forecast, and that's directly linked to their reforms, in particular on planning. So there's some light and hope there as well.
There is, but the problem is, isn't it, that some of this stuff, the results out of Rachel Reeves' control. I mean, we've just been talking about tariffs, which could eviscerate that headroom entirely. And, you know, the government's very aware of that, aren't they?
Absolutely. And look, the world is such an uncertain place. And I think what the government want to do is to provide a bit of stability in the face of all of that. It's actually really unfortunate that the tariffs were announced overnight, just the day after the spring statement, and have potentially had such an impact there on one of our greatest industries. That's an example of something that, although the government are working with the US and constantly talking to DC, there's little that they can do on this. So yes, there are things that are outside of her control. They're doing their best.
Yeah, and Heather, we're also hearing today, you know, from the IFS and others suggesting that it's going to be really sticky this year, really tricky, and that Labour may well be forced to put up taxes again at the next budget in October. And that's going to be quite tough. I mean, not just politically, also given the fact that taxes are quite high in this country as it is, but also I can well imagine from now until October there will just be endless speculation about that's maybe the path the Chancellor has to go down.
Yeah, I mean, as you said at the outset, Darren, this is not a happy moment and was anticipated not to be a happy moment. And the first few months and potentially years of this Labour government were always anticipated to be having to make pretty tough decisions. Rachel did promise at the CBI conference that I sat in the hall, and business were really wanting to gun for her with the economy and various decisions as they were last year. And she made that promise to them that she would not be increasing taxes further. I know the CBI have reminded her of that in their response to the spring statement, which is unsurprising. I think she'll want to do everything she can to avoid that. Now, obviously, where she's looking is to make sure that that stability of this government does what it says it's going to do is there, and whether that's on taxes or whether that's on maintaining the fiscal rules in the face of change. That's the dance that they're trying to dance there.
Indeed. OK, Heather, really appreciate your insight this afternoon. Heather Vernon there. Thank you very much indeed. Well, it wasn't just taxes and welfare where the Chancellor received a backlash. Rachel Reeves also said, of course, the civil service would be streamlined, i.e. it's going to face cuts running potentially up to 15%. Let's speak to Adam Hadley, Chief Executive of Quant Spark. Adam, very good afternoon to you. Is your sense that the civil service is too big?
Well, the civil service has certainly grown in size quite considerably since Brexit and COVID. And I think what's exciting about what's been announced over the past couple of months is that the government is really taking AI seriously, and in particular, generative AI. So the hope is that generative AI, if deployed well, may be able to provide the tools needed to ensure the civil service can be more productive, and also hopefully set a good example for the rest of the economy.
Yeah, and we talk about AI, and you're right, it is clearly, it's with us, and it's only going to get better and better at what it does. But it's quite difficult to work out, isn't it, in terms of what precisely it can do. This is an ongoing process, isn't it? Whereas these job cuts, the government would say, are going to happen irrespective of where we end up. This is a target it needs to meet.
Well, exactly, and this is going to be tremendously difficult. I'm cautiously optimistic that generative AI will be able to provide value. However, it's going to require a lot of upfront investment. And the work that I lead, supporting supermarkets and government departments to find opportunity for AI, is really difficult because the technology is really sophisticated. In some ways, AI is more powerful than people realize. However, it's very hard to deploy in real life because you need the data infrastructure, you need the processes, you need to understand how people are working and what they're doing. So the problem is that AI can only be useful if you prepared the organization for software, for the advances of generative AI, and that takes a lot of political will, is expensive and takes time. Now, the government has set up quite a few initiatives that have been really successful. Actually, Number 10 Downing Street has a specialist AI transformation team. Not many people know about this, and it's been having great success. Similarly, the Home Office has an innovation hub called the Accelerated Capability Environment, which drives innovation in the Home Office and elsewhere. And the Foreign Office has an AI team as well, and they've been making great strides. However, to have a significant impact, what the government needs to do is to invest a lot more in those transformational skills. And what we're interested in hearing more about is what the government can do to incentivize businesses to invest in AI, because there is a sense in which, despite the UK leading the way in research in AI, the science is really sophisticated. Unfortunately, we're really lagging behind most other countries in terms of deploying AI in real companies and real organizations.
But Adam, also, some of our Achilles heels are also the fact that do we even have enough data centers? Do we even have energy to run those data centers that doesn't cost a bomb? And also, when particularly comes to the civil service, potentially handling very sensitive information about UI and everyone else watching this programme, can they guarantee that it's not hackable?
Yeah, there are a whole host of challenges, and you're quite right to point out that data centers and energy is one of those challenges. But I think what's great about the new government and its focus on AI is that it's recognizing the importance of AI safety. We have to make sure that AI is deployed safely and securely and protects people's privacy. But we've also got to be more positive and recognize that AI potentially provides a great economic opportunity for us. So it's great to see that there's a healthy balance emerging between those who are quite rightly concerned about safety, but also those who are excited about the opportunity. But the thing is, it's going to take a lot longer than people think to deploy this effectively. It's the same with electricity. Electricity took a long time to be adopted in factories, many decades, in fact. And I'd imagine AI will also take a lot longer than we expect.
Well, it may do, but we're also in a period of time in which, growth is a hell of a lot faster than it was 100, 150 years ago. I think, Adam, just very finally, the bottom line about all of this, though, it does mean job losses. We're talking about 15% in the civil service. That's only likely to grow, and elsewhere in the economy too.
Well, in the short term, it may result in some people losing their jobs, but I think we've got to be hopeful that we can be creative, we can find new ways of deploying our intellectual and creative capabilities. And it could well be that AI automates a lot of the drudge work, a lot of the repetitive work, a lot of the admin. So I'm hopeful that as long as it's deployed well, AI will mean that we no longer have to do boring jobs, and that should free up our time to be more creative, to think more, and to use our brain in ways that are more fulfilling. But I completely agree with you, in the short term, there might be a bit of a disruption, and that's why it's really important that the government invests in AI skills and training, because who knows what the jobs in 5 years' time will be. Indeed,
and Adam, more time I have to think would be a good thing, I think, for everyone. But the big question also, is it going to make us more productive? Because we haven't had really this technological productive balance that everyone talks about. But fascinating stuff. Adam, really appreciate your time. Adam Hadley there, Chief Executive of QuantSpark. Thank you. Now, Sky, the owner of Sky News, has announced 2,000 jobs are at risk, actually, its customer service centres. The company said its proposals, including the closure of 3 UK sites, would affect 7% of its overall workforce and were currently subject to consultation. Meanwhile, British Steel, the UK's second biggest steel producer, is in discussions with trade unions about a redundancy process that could result in between 2,000 to 3,000 job cuts. It's first broke by our city editor, Mark Kleiman, and it's a move that will pile pressure on the government to improve an offer of taxpayer aid to the company. Now, let's move away from business for a second, if we can, because Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has been speaking at the International Arctic Forum in Russia. He's been talking about Greenland and the US. Let's just have a listen in.
For anybody, and it would be a great mistake to believe that these are just some eccentric talk of new American administration. Nothing of the kind. In fact, such plans were obvious back in 1860s. Back then, the U.S. administration considered the possibility of annexation of Greenland and Iceland, but this idea was not supported by Congress at that time. Let me remind you that by 1869, the American papers laughed at the purchase of Alaska. The deal was called a folly. Alaska was called an icebox. And polar bear's garden of Andrew Johnson, the U.S. president at the time. So the suggestion to incorporate Greenland failed at the time, but now the purchase of Alaska obviously is looked at the U.S. quite differently, just like the deeds of Andrew Johnson. So it is nothing surprising about what's happening now, especially since the story only started back then, but it continued later on. In 1910, a tripartite swap transaction was put together, bringing together the United States, Germany, and Denmark. The Greenland would go to the United States, but the transaction failed at the time. During the Second World War, the United States...
There you go, that's Vladimir Putin speaking in Russia about the Arctic, effectively saying that geopolitical rivalry has heated up in the Arctic and suggesting that the US is serious about Greenland. I think that's a reference to the ambitions that Donald Trump, the US president, has about potentially trying to effectively co-opt Greenland into the United States. He also says the US will promote its interests in the Arctic, that there are concerns that NATO sees the North as a possible foothold for other conflicts, and that while Russia, this is Vladimir Putin, has never threatened anyone in the Arctic, they are watching the position closely and that they will defend their interests. So that's Vladimir Putin speaking about Greenland, the Arctic, suggesting that things are going to heat up in that part of the world, particularly with the United States' ambitions for Greenland. We'll keep across that speech from Vladimir Putin, and we'll have more on that with Mark Austin on the NewsHour at 5 o'clock. We're staying with US-related news. We're going to talk about that huge security breach earlier this week in which top US officials accidentally included a journalist on a group chat about plans to bomb Yemen. Democrats and a number of Republicans are demanding real answers, describing the Trump administration as complete amateurs who should now face harsh consequences. Though in the last couple of minutes, the US Attorney General suggested that that is not going to happen. Let's speak to David Holtzman. He's former chief scientist at IBM and is now Chief Strategy Officer at Norris Protocol. Very good afternoon to you, David. Just first of all, talk about Signal if we can. Lots of people in this country are very au fait with things like WhatsApp, maybe Telegram to a degree, less so Signal. What is it and how secure is it, if you like?
Signal's very secure, and they innovated a protocol. It's an open source protocol that's actually used by WhatsApp and Apple's iMessage. So from an encryption, end-to-end encryption viewpoint, Signal's quite secure. However, that's not the whole story, as we saw in this debacle this week. The end-to-end encryption may be fine, but the individual participants' devices may not be, and they can be attacked. That could have happened, and that's one of the reasons people are so upset. The other reason is because there's very clear protocol for how to have this kind of communication, and that involves something called a SCIF, which is a sensitive computing information facility. All of these people had access to them. They're secure rooms that can't be spied on.
Isn't it interesting, though, and we get it because we all now use this technology in our everyday life, often at work too, but the concern clearly is that top officials in the US government with really high-level security clearance are discussing things that effectively aren't being done in the old school way of doing things, which is through very secure channels with officials involved, that sort of stuff. So effectively what I'm trying to say is this new technology is more open to being taken advantage of or mistakes being made with. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair. Also, not to cast stones, but out of the 19 people in that chat, most of them had no real experience in government before. So they probably didn't know how to do this. And my guess is they probably didn't listen. So part of the problem, another problem I have is they all seem very comfortable with that chat based on the transcript, which implies that they've done it more than once, and that, in fact, may be the way they do business.
And so what's the answer to this, then, if we do think, it's far from ideal in the best possible way? Is it that, effectively, governments need to look at things like Signal and kind of embrace them and make them work for modern communication, even among, cabinet ministers in the US government? Or is it that the US government needs to be clear with its own officials and even with the president himself saying, hold on a second, let's go back to the tried and trusted technology we've used in the past?
My opinion would be the latter, not the former. There are protocols. They've been around for a long time. I adhered to them when I worked at NSA. I know a lot of other people did. And if you look back at military history, there are many good examples of military intelligence turning a conflict, such as World War II, the Enigma machine, and the Purple cipher that was broken from the Japanese. If you have access to what your opponent is going to do militarily before they do it, it's a huge advantage.
Do you think there'll be any consequences around this? We just heard from the US Attorney General saying it is unlikely, but do you think that maybe, even people like Pete Hegseth may well think again in the future about using Signal?
I have to tell you, I'm very cynical about this. I don't think anything will happen. They may, historically, they pick a sacrificial goat and then they become the problem. I mean, both administrations have done that in the past. What they should do is what you said earlier. They should advocate and enforce strong protocol for secure information. I mean, if you look at that transcript, they were Pete Hegseth was very specific. He was talking about FA-18F jets when they were going to launch. The fact they were using MQ-9 drones.
Yeah. It was very detailed, and as you say, also very relaxed. As you definitely got the sense they'd done it before. David, we're going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time, but fascinating stuff. Thank you very much indeed, David Holzman there. Just to bring up a little bit of news before we leave, and that is the London Fire Brigade confirming that fire at the substation, which closed Heathrow last Friday, has now been fully extinguished. So it is now officially out. That's it from me for now. Back, of course, at 11:30 tomorrow. Mark Austin is up next with the News Hour. Very goodbye.